Welcome to the Sun Mall podcast, where we interview the stars of e-commerce. Today we have Irene Liu of Chiyo, which is a premier delivery service throughout the maternity process. Hi. So the first question I had today was maybe you can talk a little bit more about your background. I know you did consulting, you did an MBA, MPH. So maybe you can talk a little bit more of your background and how some of the key lessons there and how that made your way into Chiyo.
I'm Irene. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Chiyo. We are Eastern food therapy meets nutritional science nutrition program for women through different life stages, from fertility, prenatal to postpartum. How I got here. So my background prior to starting this, after college, I worked in consulting for several years at Bain. I was mostly doing retail, grocery, growth equity work, but was always very interested in nutrition education and healthy food access. And so that's what I did at a nonprofit on the south side of Chicago before I went to graduate school. And so I actually started Chiyo while I was in graduate school doing a policy and business dual degree. Initially thinking that I was going to work in kind of the economic development, food access type of work. And so Chiyo kind of happened out of left field because during COVID, my aunt had a baby. And so that was the first time I saw, how she was caring for herself and using a postpartum meal program, and how my mom was, helping her navigate, what are the different symptoms that you're experiencing and how can you solve for those with whole food options. And so I was like, okay, this is fascinating. What are other countries doing? What does postpartum care look like in the US? And just realized what a gap there was between, what the standard of care is in other countries versus what's available in the US, and really taking holistic care into account in other countries, and knowing that that should be the standard of care in the US. So essentially in the US, I don't know how much you know about maternal health currently, but in the US, it really is very subpar. Women often after birth, they kind of are good luck, like take care of, here's the baby, come back for pediatrician visits, but then the woman doesn't go back to see her OBGYN until probably 6 weeks after birth, sometimes longer. I think a lot of stuff is changing, thankfully, because there's been a lot of issues with postpartum depression and screening for health issues, and the maternal death rate is really bad in the US. I think it's the worst for a developing country. And so there's so much care that's not given to women in this time. And if you look at policy on, family leave and the investment in women's health, like all of it is really dire. And so that was really the motivation for us bringing kind of what we know is the best of in other countries and making this more the standard of care in the US. And so I got connected with my co-founder. My co-founder is a clinical nutritionist focused on the fertility through postpartum phase. And so that's when we ended up doing a pilot together that fall, literally just delivering kind of this like optimal postpartum recovery nutrition program to women in New York. I was driving from Philly, where I was in business school, and delivering the meals with Jennifer. So it was extremely startup scrappy. And we used a lot of that to just understand kind of like what our customers, like how to make this an easier experience for our customers, where can we create delight, what information did they want from us, what's the configurations and pricing. And so from that, we learned a lot. I think the crazy part about our origin story is I actually knew that we needed a lot of R&D to make it the best product that we knew our customers wanted. And I had maybe a week of calls with just kind of like friendly calls with investors, and realized it was just an uphill battle, like trying to convince people who haven't experienced it to understand the value and see us differently, where we're not just a meal plan, but it's really like nutrition education in an experiential way. But I think thankfully what happened was, after I had that realization of, okay, it's going to be difficult to get the funds to invest in this, we became the first organic Google search result, like literally overnight. We had a website and no full-time team. Both Jennifer and I working on this part-time, and obviously like no money for the business. And so then we got thousands of dollars in pre-orders, and that's how we were like, oh my god, we these are like newly postpartum women, we have to get them the product as soon as possible because they've kind of relied and trusted us with their care. um, and so we literally just cobbled it together in January of 2021. And then kind of the cultural momentum took over. We got features in New York Times and Bon Appetit all in our first quarter. And so the whole first year was just ship the product. Like there was no marketing. There really was no full-time team. It was just get the product out. And so it's been really a whirlwind since then. So I'm happy to talk about any part of that or like what was most helpful in consulting.
For sure. I think that that was, yeah, maybe we can just do a quick follow-up. Any kind of key lessons from consulting that was really helpful in that journey?
Um, yeah, it's interesting because as our company has progressed, I feel like the consulting kind of toolkit has become even more helpful than the earliest days. I think in the earliest days, what was helpful about consulting was just being able to figure things out and do it super quickly, and in a scrappy way. Because oftentimes in consulting, like for example, when I was doing like growth equity diligences, you had a week to figure out a whole market. And so I think taking that kind of belief in yourself that you can figure it out was really helpful in the early days. But then I think now at the stage that we're at, I find a lot of the consulting skills even more helpful and relevant. And I think actually the most helpful with consulting is just like this way of structured thinking, and being able to break down a problem so that it's not so overwhelming. Like for example, like I've never done growth marketing before, but in my head it's like, okay, there's a new challenge. And so then like doing a bit of reading, talking to a few people, and then basically like creating a plan from that, and then like testing and iterating. But I think my ability to do that with confidence and quickly is probably from the consulting kind of training. And then the second thing is just on people skills. I think with and that's from a few dimensions. I think what you learn from consulting is like the whole business is about people. And so how do you connect with and build trust with your clients very quickly? Also, how do you build trust and work really efficiently with new managers and new partners all the time, as well as managing down with new associates and training them. And so, kind of that 360 ability to communicate really effectively and use influence to get the job done, I think has served me really well in this role, especially as we've grown, whether that's working with different brand partners or onboarding new team members, learning how to deal with investors and giving them the proper amount of kind of information and bringing them along the journey while also making sure our team feels really empowered and motivated.
Makes sense. So, A, consulting in the early days kind of gave you the work ethic, the tight deadlines. So, in the scrappy days when you got that like boost of demand, you were able to do that. And now that you're a little more established, having the structured thinking, so stuff like marketing or whatever, you can break down the problem. And then also, consulting is a
Mm-hmm.
very outward facing role. You have to talk to a lot of people. So, having that ability to talk to whatever the stakeholders, internal team or vendors or customers, you kind of have that skill set. Um,
Yeah.
and then just backtracking, when you were talking about Chiyo and this story, I really found that stat to be crazy. That the U.S. actually has kind of one of the worst maternal care and post-maternal care. That's really sad to hear. Um, one of the things you said is you guys kind of got that boost of demand kind of through a Google search, and you guys got listed at the top. Was there anything you did there to be kind of listed near the top?
It's funny because I wish I could tell you yes, so that there's like a strategy behind it, but truly it was very lucky. I think probably a few things is like one, our whole website is written around like fertility and prenatal and postpartum, and so I think it really shows what a lack of options there were previously that we rose up so quickly. And then my co-founder, she's been in this space for a while, and so there were a number of co-authored articles that she'd written before. And so I think when we linked that to our website, then I think that also helped like boost the relevancy.
Makes sense. So there was just like organic demand and that kind of keyword, and you guys kind of identified that white space. And then the
Mhm.
second thing, your co-founder had a little bit of background, some articles, so a little bit of kind of SEO pull that you guys were able to use. And
Yeah.
then nowadays, what are kind of the best marketing channels for you guys?
Yeah, it's funny because it's still organic Google search is still a big driver for us. We have only recently started doing paid marketing actually, and so a lot of it is still very organic, like our social media channel. Like mostly we were on Instagram previously, and then we do a lot of brand partnerships, so that gets us kind of like in front of our brand partners, audiences. And then now we've recently only started experimenting with TikTok and really investing into our email marketing. Um, but I would say before that, it was very much organic and also like a lot of word of mouth from clinicians that would hear about us or birth workers that would hear about us. And so we did a lot more community building in the early days.
Makes sense. So just a couple follow-ups there. I think one thing you mentioned was kind of brand partnerships. So any kind of tips on, identifying who to partner with, how to structure these partnerships in a good way?
Yeah, there's a number of different partnerships that we do. So Um, typically, it was more of like a brand partnership angle. So that would be something like a lifestyle brand or a women's health company that we would do some of these like content sharing partnerships because I think our value for a lot of them is that they know that their audience is interested in holistic health and nutrition is always a very important part of the journey, but they don't have the expertise. And so we kind of help on a content sharing perspective there. Um, Normally on like their social channels. And then more recently, we've started doing partnerships with fertility clinics after we launched our hormonal health and fertility program recently. And so those are much more integrated partnerships where the clinicians are actually recommending our program to their patients, like on their fertility journey. And so those are kind of like higher touch versus lower touch, but also like the outcomes are different of like awareness versus conversion.
Makes sense. So kind of finding people who content they might not have the capacity to, or they're just really interested in, and so kind of partnering on the content perspective there. One thing you mentioned is kind of you guys kind of really focused on kind of community building. Is that mainly through Instagram, or were there any kind of channels you used for community building? And then a kind of quick follow up there is I remember earlier in the conversation, you said you guys had to, really get feedback on the formulation. And so, like, how did you use or talk to your users to kind of get that feedback?
Yeah. So on the community side, it was mostly Instagram. I think what really helped for us was a lot of our press pieces were pretty in depth and really told our story really well. And so as a result, I think people felt an affinity to us from just reading our story in press, and then they follow us on Instagram, and then kind of that the whole thing happened. We also used to do more community pop up events. So we would like pop up at a brand partner's store, for example. We've done stuff at like Hatch, which is like a maternity wear company, as well as like some clinics that we've popped up with, or Borum, which is a postpartum hotel in New York. And so then when we did those, and we would kind of like open up to the community so people could come try the food, meet others. And we also hosted our own pop-up events, one in New York and then one in LA. This was in 2022. And so I think because of that, it's a lot of community building in terms of IRL types of community building, but then also um, kind of them knowing our story and following us on Instagram and seeing kind of like our behind the scenes as we're building. But I think the next part of community that we're thinking about is not just like the one-to-one relationship of like brand to user, but actually like the full community and like how do other people interact with each other. Because I think that's something that we've been hearing with our customers. And then to your other question about the early days of getting feedback, we actually in the early days like we'd send delivery reminders, for example. And so oftentimes then they would text us back if like something went wrong, if they had feedback on a meal, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's kind of funny because after we expanded from that, then we were doing automated text, but then we didn't really have like a text line. And so then people were emailing us. But recently, in the last few months, we actually brought back our text line. So it's called the Chiyo Concierge. And so that's how our customers feel like they have a place to go to and be heard and trusted during this time.
Makes sense. So in terms of community building, like Instagram, you guys had those press releases, and that was kind of really in depth targeting your target audience. And then the pop up events, you kind of built the community, but also you could use that pop up media in digital content to give behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes. And that's really interesting on your other point about texting. The automated texts don't really, like, no one wants to text an automated number back, but because you guys are delivering, having that text channel really allows you to get authentic feedback there when you're delivering. So just speaking of the
Mm-hmm.
delivery, you guys have like a food product and it's relatively fresher than most products. So how did you guys kind of manage the supply chain there?
Um, yeah, so we do nationwide shipping now, so I think that was like a huge undertaking and project. So we actually spent all of summer 2022 doing a lot of testing of different types of packaging, doing test shipments, measuring the temperature when it arrived on the other side of the US. And so I think a lot of that is just like a lot of testing and then knowing like the right configuration, like how many ice packs need to go in, how does it need to be packaged? There's not a lot of movement so that things don't get damaged. So I think all of that is just like testing and continuing to test things. I think the benefit for us is that there's a lot of supporting infrastructure that exists nowadays compared to what used to exist for perishable companies before. And so, we use like outsource, like third party delivery company, which has been great. We buy all of our supplies from different types of vendors who are all very reliable. And so yeah, like I think at this point of our company, it hasn't been too much of a problem, but definitely when you're earlier on, for example, like the delivery situation was really hard for us in the early days when we didn't have enough volume.
Makes sense. So once you kind of get enough volume, there's these more established infrastructure, third-party services you can use, and then maybe you test a couple and kind of find the best ones for you, and then you kind
Mm-hmm.
of have a stable base. You don't really have to worry about. So that's kind of it for the supply chain. One thing I wanted to know was, when I was checking out your site, you guys kind of have this quiz. So, what was kind of the concept behind the quiz? And then B, you guys have kind of this huge learn section. So how do you guys come up with content to put in the learn section?
Yeah, I'll talk about the learn section first because I think that's more straightforward. I actually think our learn section, there's so much more that we want to write there, and it actually hasn't been a priority just because we've been so underwater. Um, but I think for us, especially in this space and our offering, there's a lot to cover because it's not just covering kind of care in each specific um, life stage, like fertility, prenatal, postpartum, like all of those has its own whole ecosystem of information of like what your body is going through. But then also nutrition is its whole own ecosystem of how to care for women, especially through those trimesters. And I think layering on top of that is our unique kind of addition is the traditional Chinese medicine element of it. And so that is like its whole own ecosystem. And so for us, kind of how we bridge all of that together is like our whole brand is about stage and symptom specific care. And so all of the content is around a specific stage. And then what are the symptoms that you're going through and how can nutrition and Chinese medicine help with natural remedies for that? So there's kind of like an endless supply of content ideas. It's more an issue of capacity for us to actually deliver on them, but we hope to soon. Um, on the discover your plan section, I think we actually started this before. I think from the very beginning, but the intent of it has changed over time. The initial intent was actually to just understand our customers and what they were interested in, where they were coming from, because at the time we had a very limited offering. Originally, we only had our postpartum program and it was only available in Manhattan. So like that's extremely limiting. But I think we want to know kind of where we were getting all these email inquiries from, where did they live, like why were they interested in us, what other offerings did they want from us, like, and that helped us gauge when and how to expand, especially for like nationwide shipping or what other stages that are most helpful to address. And so I think that was the initial intent, and then kind of now going forward, how we use it is actually more about onboarding for our clients. And so when they purchase a program, we always kind of remind them part of the onboarding process is like actually going through the plan. So we actually have a baseline of what dietary restrictions they have, what stage are they starting at, because that also dictates what program we'll give them, to the point of like they tell us when their estimated due date is for postpartum so that we can tailor the tonics and broths of that program to what week that they're in.
Totally makes sense. So on the kind of quiz front, the big focus maybe initially was more for kind of customer feedback, but now you get like dates and specifics there. So
Mm-hmm.
you can, tailor the exact broths and stuff like that for your customers. And then for the content section and the learn section, you guys have a lot of different things you can talk about, from the Chinese medicine to maternal nutrition. So there's a lot of kind of
Mm-hmm.
different intersecting verticals, which kind of allows you to create a lot of content there. I think one thing you mentioned is you're constantly having to do stuff. What is kind of the big focus for the next 6 months?
Yeah, for us, it's kind of crazy, but up until now, we have always just had like a lot of organic demand, and that's still there. But I think we're getting to an evolution of our company of actually being much more tight on our analytics and knowing the conversion funnel. And so, kind of the focus of the next few months, kind of internally, is really, you know, drilling down on our OKRs, and really putting kind of like tasks to those OKRs, and then really understanding what our conversion awareness and conversion funnel looks like, of where we should be optimizing, for example, our email flows that aren't very good, or in our traffic, like where we should be investing our time, and then also figuring out where, for we're super lean team, so where can we put more automation, for example, in some of the email flows that we're like sending manually right now. And so that's all of like the professionalization and evolution of our company.
Makes sense. So in the early days, you're kind of more scrappy. There was a lot of organic growth, but now you need to want to be a little more structured, analytical about the growth, and then also the processes. Make
Mm-hmm.
sure they're fully automated, so you can scale your team as much as possible. And then
Yeah.
speaking, so we have the 6 months. What is kind of the long-term goal or uh, plan for Chiyo?
Yeah. Yeah. So we've always thought of our nutrition program as like the entry point where we serve the hardest part for our customers and where they're experiencing the biggest pain point, and understanding how to optimize their nutrition, but then the actual execution of it as well. But the idea is actually then that opens up a whole ecosystem of their care that's personalized to their stage and their symptoms. And so we want to be kind of the one place that they go to for holistic care during this time. And so that means, having a database of content that is bite sized, but incorporates both, clinical science from the Western perspective, but also Chinese medicine from an Eastern perspective. And so they can kind of choose where they want to play in that kind of modality of care, but then also be able to purchase some of the items off of that, that's kind of subsets of our nutrition program or different boosters on their own, so that it really creates kind of their personalized care plan, that's whole foods based for their stage and symptoms.
Makes sense. So really kind of expanding to be, a holistic solution for their entire maternal care journey. And
Mm-hmm.
then just stepping back from Chiyo, just overall, are there any kind of trends in commerce, e-commerce, that you're kind of excited about?
I think because I've been spending a lot of time on TikTok recently, I do think that this was already the case before TikTok, but I think even more so with TikTok. I think the portfolio of brands is kind of the way to go versus investing all up in one brand. Mainly because even when I see like on TikTok how um, people are creating different profiles for different types of content. So like one content might be all about, I don't know, olive oil. Another one is all about nail polish. Like you can't actually combine it all into one. And so then when you really build your audience on TikTok, that's all about that one product, and you can sell a product from that really well. But then kind of like the messaging of it has to be really tight and really be brand aligned. And so I think going forward, like actually, because a lot of things can be commoditized and there's 5 million drop shippings and 5 million Amazon storefronts, like brand becomes like even more important.
That really makes sense. It's a really kind of competitive industry, and so if your profile is just kind of a mix of many things, it's really hard to differentiate on these social media channels.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really trying to stand out, and if you do want to sell multiple diverse things, maybe establishing a couple of different TikTok profiles to do that. And then one other question I had is, were there any kind of helpful resources, groups, communities, podcasts, events that you kind of found helpful throughout your journey?
Um, yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think the ones that I really like recently, I've been listening to the Crazy Ones, if you've heard of that one, but it's like the Morning Brew. One of the Morning Brew co-founders started that one. That's like just like super tactical, like day to day issues that founders run into. And then I also, listen to like Second Life, like ones that are much more focused on female founders or female startup club. And those they do interviews with female founders and like their early days and things like that. And then I do also read a number of newsletters. One that recently I liked is First Round Capital has a newsletter that they have kind of like showcasing different types of businesses and kind of like the models that they've tested. Yeah, so I think a lot of that, and then obviously like talking to founders is always super helpful, especially ones that are a few steps ahead of you. And so I'm somebody that's like not shy about a cold email or like a cold LinkedIn message,
Yeah.
especially if I think that there's like something relevant. And like obviously, I'm always like, I will like any way that I can help, let me know as well, to pay back the favor. Yeah, and then in terms of events, I recently went to oh, I'm blinking on it. Female Founders Fund had a CEO summit in January of this year or February. But I thought that was super helpful because they kind of brought back a lot of the founders that kind of were like all over the media in the last decade, and so kind of hearing like their stories and kind of what was happening behind the scenes compared to what you read in the news story, I think was also super helpful as well. Yeah, but I would say a lot of the content that I consume that's helpful for me is both from a startup perspective and from a female founder perspective.
Makes sense. Yeah, I personally like the first round review, kind of the newsletter article, blog stuff they post out. I found it kind of useful. And then I think you had a great point. Basically, I think if you're kind of founded a business, you really have to get comfortable with cold emailing, cold LinkedIning, and
Mm-hmm.
really hustling there.
Yeah.
And then, kind of final question. This is more of a fun one. Any recent shopping experience or brand you've really been impressed with lately?
I feel like there definitely must be. One that I really like, and it's local. I'm based in Detroit. Um, is a chocolate company actually called Bon Bon Bon, and I think what's really amazing about it is um, if you if you just think of it at the surface level, which is like a gourmet chocolate shop, you're like, what's so special about it? But I think when you like they have an e-com store but also retail stores in Detroit, and when you go in it's like a whole experience. Like it's very brand first, and even like you can tell there's a lot of special touches to how they did the packaging or how every chocolate looks and how what the ingredients are and what the naming of the chocolates are. Like there's so much intentionality behind it that it's not like an algorithm came up with this. Like they didn't see like what was the big trend of where the money is and I'll apply it here. Like it's like true, like it's there's so much like creativity and thought that goes into it that then just makes it like a really unique experience. And I think that that's something I am really impressed by, because I think in this day and age a lot of everything that we do is like, how do we optimize XYZ? Let's use AI for this. And so there's kind of the element of human touch that I think really makes a difference.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sun Mall Podcast. Please make sure to subscribe.